getting into events, many people kind of start, and the first thing that catches them out is the professional health and safety and legislation that can go along and around events and the liability that can be potentially upon their head should any misfortune, mishap, or anything happen to anybody at that event during that time. And I'll give you an example of that. I can remember one of our very first award ceremonies. We had the kind of winners photo right at the end of the show on the stage. And at the back, there was a trestle table that the awards had been sat on, ready to be handed out to the winners. And one of the attendees decided to stand on that trestle table and it folded on him and he broke his nose. Now, luckily for us, he didn't point the finger at us. He didn't blame us for that. But in a world where potentially that can happen and people do point the finger is a real thing. And that's where, a lot of people kind of forget about it or don't realize when they first getting started. So that was one of the aha moments for us, shall we say.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Events are back, and they seem to be back with a vengeance, so I'm super excited to be chatting with Adam Parry, who wears a bunch of hats that all revolve around events, the Event Industry News, which is the publication for the industry. So, Adam, I'll let you introduce the events around the event marketing industry that you've launched in conjunction with the Event Industry News to start off with, and then we'll talk about the evolution of events pre and post pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on, and hopefully I can impart some nuggets of knowledge to your listeners. So, as you already said, I'm the founder, co-founder, and editor of a publication called Event Industry News. We are a global trade publication, and our readership are professional event organizers, but also anybody that's starting out. They've fallen into organizing events, as many of us do, and maybe they need some help and some resource and some knowledge and some direction on kind of how to do it more professionally. Ultimately, that obviously has led us to want to put our own events on. And we produce a number of events for event professionals. Our main focuses predominantly are in technology, innovation, sustainability, and accessibility. So those things actually go harmonious together, and most of our events are co-located because that's the most sustainable way to produce them. So we have those brands here in London, in the UK. Those events take place in November. And then we also produce those same events, Event Tech Live and Event Sustainability Live, should I say, in Las Vegas across the 1st and 2nd of May. All our events are free to attend because we believe in free access to information, knowledge, and networking. And we believe that's the lifeblood of what makes events great, people coming together and kind of sharing that information and that knowledge. And ultimately, they are, commercially funded through those companies who want to reach that audience to hopefully help them and supply their events and things like that. So we reach individuals and people from probably north of 100 countries a year. Our events aren't the South by Southwests of the industry. I wish my event was 300,000 people. We're probably closer to 4,000 or 5,000 people at any of our events and things like that. But they're still great events. And we try and not only focus on the event activity that happens, in the trade show hall or in the conference center or whatever, we try and focus and are continually focus on how are we engaging our attendees in and around the event? How are we supporting getting more value of their time in London, their time in Vegas, to connect, to network, and hopefully to build better businesses?
So yeah, I'd love to get now. Did you launch the publication before you got into the events business for yourself?
We did, yeah. So me and my co-founder actually worked for a print publication. And ultimately, Event Industry News was an idea that we brought to them to say, hey, we've got an event, we've got a website for this publication, but we're not utilizing it. We're not publishing any news. We have a reader cap of 10,000. That's very limiting. Why publish news on this? Was at the dawn of Twitter, and to reach a wider audience. And that company really didn't like that idea at all. So ultimately, funnily enough, that publication is no longer in existence. And we've grown to be reaching somewhere closer to 250,000 professionals every single year through Event Industry News and the mediums that we use.
So I'm curious because you obviously had to jump into events production yourself, right?
Yes.
With your teams. Were there any sort of shocks, despite the fact that you were already in the industry covering it, where you're like, oh my God, this is so much harder than I thought it was, and I completely failed to take into account A, B, and C? Were there sort of any epiphanies you had?
Oh, absolutely, Kevin. Yeah, more than I could probably care to podcast, to be honest with you. Before our first event, I'd never organized anything, not even a birthday party. And one of the attendees decided to stand on that trestle table and it folded on him and he broke his nose. Now, luckily for us, he didn't point the finger at us. He didn't blame us for that. But in a world where potentially that can happen and people do point the finger is a real thing. And that's where, a lot of people kind of forget about it or don't realize when they first getting started. So that was one of the aha moments for us, shall we say.
Yeah. And I when I think about the intersection of alcohol and events, I think that exacerbates that risk, and you really do need to have all your ducks in a row from that perspective.
Absolutely. And sometimes including yourself.
Right, for sure. Another question, like obviously that there are a bunch of events, particularly B2B events, where all the freight is carried by the sponsors and exhibitors and it's free to the attendee,
Sure.
especially if the attendee meets some kind of a filter, right? They
Mhm.
have to be of a company of a certain size and have a particular title or better. But I increasingly see events where even if they're doing that, they sometimes simultaneously have sort of a ticketing option for the folks who don't meet that criteria. Maybe they're earlier in the industry, and so the sponsors aren't willing to pick up the tab for those people. But yet the event producers are sort of thinking, well, maybe it's okay if those people they may graduate into the class where they're eventually worthy. Are there any good strategies around that where he's sort of thinking through maybe from a pricing perspective or even whether you offer that or not? Like should there always be a paid option for the sort of non-VIP or non-qualified attendee?
Yeah, there are so many strategies when it comes to pricing and structure and access and things like that. And ultimately, as any business owner, as any organizer, if you can charge at all ends and you can provide value, because that has to come with value, you can provide that value at all ends of the market, then you have the golden egg. If you can get $2,000-$3,000 out of an attendee for them to come to pay big bucks, if you can do all that, that is fantastic. But I would say that's extremely challenging unless you're extremely experienced and you have done a huge amount of due diligence over what you're launching and what that value is. A great example of that is an event that's in Vegas that's just recently launched, and I say recently over the past couple of years, called Manifest. Manifest has grown now to 6,000 attendees in the short space of a couple of years and has really hit on a niche and a need for that sector to come together and provide this event that helps them do business. And that is one of those events that can charge at one end. Some other people do use that, though, as a strategy to leverage exhibitors to provide value. So they use the exhibitors to drive attendees by giving them tickets of a certain value, which ultimately then those exhibitors offer out either free or to bring their customers and prospects in. And that's another great strategy in terms of that. One here in the UK that I've seen recently is a very, very small charge. We're talking like $15-$20 to come to the event and expo. And that company there is really just using that as a strategy of commitment. Because if anybody registers for an event for free, then what real commitment is to them coming up?
Right.
One event that I really admire for what they did was Web Summit, when Web Summit launched.
For sure.
And that tactic of, let's have an alpha program for these companies that want to present. Let's give them a space for one day on the proviso that they buy 3 tickets to the event, which they can either use for their team or again distribute out. And that was really interesting to me in the ways that they obviously have a 3-day show, which compounded that by all these people having 3 tickets and only exhibiting for one day, which created an audience for the event. I think if you're charging for access to the event, your content has to be stellar, really, really strong. And I don't necessarily mean getting the A-listers and those kind of high-flying celebrities, because to be honest with you, what can you hear at an event that you've not heard on social media these days? But I think really well thought out content and really stuff that people go away with and makes an impact to their business and things like that. But it can be done.
That's a great point. Have things changed dramatically post-pandemic versus pre-pandemic from a event planning and management and execution perspective?
I think absolutely, yes. Now, I will argue just the same as I think you did at the beginning, that events are back. I was at Excel just the other week and pretty much all the halls were busy with events and trade shows on, and that venue is actually expanding quite considerably over the next few months to add capacity to that. So they're not going to spend north of hundreds of millions of dollars to expand a venue that's not going to get utilized. But what I am seeing I think it's slightly more challenging for people to launch events at the moment, more established events that had that previous networking history before the pandemic. Obviously, they're kind of back to where they were previously. And what I'm seeing more as an appetite is people really wanting more than just the event as the experience. They are looking for other things to do in and around the event. They're looking for experiences. Now I was talking to somebody the other day that's going to Vegas for an event, which is a 2-day event, and they're essentially going to Vegas for the entire week to try and capitalize on their time there, to have some R&R time, to have some free time, but to capitalize on the network. And I think that's something we are going to have to think more and longer and harder about as event organizers, to say, hey, we've, co-organize this event in the evening. We've done a deal with the local club, or we've done this experience, we've done this social giving activity or something like that you can get involved in, because people like that as well. It's not just about partying, it's about like actually having meaningful experiences as well. And I think there's huge amounts of opportunity there for us as well to give back as organizers to local communities and things like that, and local economy.
Yeah, that's a great point. The one of the things that I've noticed some better marketers doing is that they're really capitalizing on their event participation to do a lot of content creation. And then they're using that content super effectively from a social media perspective and from an SEO perspective. And oddly enough, from a future proofing of your SEO to AI and LLMs, the more content there is out there about you and about your brand and about, the service or product that you provide, the more informed the LLM AI model is, right? I'm not sure that everybody is doing a great job at that, but I have noticed a few marketers doing a really great job. They tend to be more sort of nerdy, techie marketers, right? That are sort of thinking about the events no longer in a silo, right? They're thinking about them a lot from a pre-event perspective, and they're also thinking about them far beyond when the event closes. Like they're getting a lot more mileage out of the content that they create at the event. Sometimes they're hosting podcasts at the events. Sometimes they're co-creating content with other folks at the event. Are there any other sort of best practices like that you see the more leading event participating brands executing against?
Absolutely, yeah. And we've actually got Atlas and Box.com coming to Event Live in Vegas to talk about their strategies. These are companies that have been using in-person and virtual events, both their own and other people's, leveraging other people's networks to raise their profile, generate leads, engagement, and things like that, and grow their businesses, which ultimately that's what events are. They're there to grow businesses. And Atlas, and I'll share with you kind of their strategy. They could only do obviously virtual through the pandemic, and they saw great success with that. Ultimately, that kind of format got extremely saturated. And to be honest with you, probably their audience got somewhat waned with the repetitiveness or another virtual event kind of thing, which is why people flocked back to in-person. But actually, they're still using virtual. They're just using a different strategy, a different format, packaging it a different way, and actually calling it a different thing. They're now calling it a content drop, back to your point about producing content. And interesting what their strategy is, they are producing a wealth of content and in written format and things like that. And then they're using one key speaker or key piece of content that's a live activation that takes place at a certain time to drive engagement there, so people can ask questions and chat and things like that. But then all of that other content becomes open and ungated and on demand as soon as that live piece is finished. So very much like in a Netflix style, you might have a premiere, but then the rest of the actual episodes are available for people to watch at their own pace. And they're seeing a lot of revitalization from that strategy and rebranding of what that is in terms of from their audience and stuff like that. And Box.com were the same. They had huge amounts of, it's a huge part of their strategy of engagement and sales driving and lead nurturing and things like that. But again, post-pandemic, they had to really kind of restructure how they were framing that and the process in which they were doing it. What kind of runs through it all is quality. The higher the production quality, the better people engage with it, because it looks good, it sounds good, it feels good. And I think that's one of the actual key benefits and learnings that came out of the pandemic. Everybody went from event organizers to production companies and broadcasters. So the quality of all of that element of the events industry now is much, much, much higher than it was in pre-pandemic in 2019 and before.
Yeah, that's great advice for folks, looking to leverage that more effectively. One thing I've until I started thinking about relaunching the e-marketing association's events business, which I acquired it, right before the pandemic, and it had already been lying fallow for a while. I started paying more attention to the nuance between conference, summit, trade show, right? And how the lines seem to have been gotten somewhat blurry as to sort of, well, what is this exactly, right? Because the more trade show-ish you are, right, the more booths you have, and the more that is sort of the forefront of the experiences, doing the trade show floor and learning from exhibitors and sponsors that way. And the more conference or summit-ish it is, it's sort of less about exhibitors, and sometimes there isn't even exhibit space, pure content, right? It is there's sponsors, but the sponsors are often pay to play up on stage doing their education, hopefully not pitching from the stage, but doing education and making the content high quality. So I'd love to get from you, sort of, for an event planner at the sort of strategic level, as they think through the different sort of formats, the more leaning more trade show style, leaning more content centric, or trying to bridge that gap, maybe call it a summit, which doesn't tell you a whole lot about, is it going to be more trade show-ish, or is it going to be more conference-like?
Yeah, I feel like Summit's more of a marketing angle than that. It seems a little bit softer. The play, I'm going to a summit. It's like it feels good. You know what? I think conferences are a great way to launch events for a community and focus on that content and build a lot of trust with, I'm not going to say very little, but less liability and gravitas that comes with a trade show, because ultimately you can expand the venue, or you can find another venue to fit the audience. You can grow, and actually you can lean on that quite heavily because if you have got a capacity of 400 for that, you can even be a little bit more picky when it comes to the actual audience that you are accepting to your event, and then that becomes very sponsorable or of great appetite to, like you say, those companies who want to speak in front of that audience and stuff like that. From the upper end, though, conferences can become one of these things that are actually these behemoths that, then people start to struggle to find the true connections in them. They can become passive participants and things like that and stuff like that. But, they can be extremely lucrative for people in terms of the way that they're structured. And conferences are actually great formats to geoclone. You can take a conference format in London and stick that in New York or LA or Singapore. You can take that format quite thin. Exhibitions are extremely lucrative. They are great businesses to be in if you can find the right fit, the right market fit, and things like that. The pressure comes there is filling the show floor, because you set your stall out of like, we're going to have this many exhibitors and we're going to go for this and and then internet venues is small deposits on houses and things like that from a cost perspective. So you have to factor that in. So I think, what I notice is that you have companies that tend to lean in one direction or the other. You tend to have companies who really nail the conference format and produce multiple conferences, either for a vertical or multiple verticals over the course of the year. And they really roll that program out, maybe with awards programs to support that. And potentially more media-based companies tend to go conference route. And then trade show organizers tend to be trade show organizers. They tend to be, and they end up having conferences and things like that. They kind of absorb them, shall we say, through, we want this trade show, it comes with this conference thing. That what a lot of trade shows are becoming, though, is confexes. So that hybridization of the trade show floor. So an example of the way that we produce it is we don't take the educational content off of the trade show floor and stick it in another part of the venue, off the floor or anything like that. We literally intermingle it in between the show floor, and then we use things like silent disco headset technology so people can focus in on the content. And the exhibitors actually really appreciate that because they feel like they're more engaged with the audience, they've got more visibility and things like that. So I'm obviously biased because that is our format, but that's my preference because I feel myself as an attendee, when I'm going from the trade show floor to a conference room and back, and I feel like I'm constantly doing a lot of walking backwards and forwards and things like that. So that's my preference. And if anybody was kind of thinking of that mix of content and trade show sales and growth on that side of things, that's what I would honestly suggest they go down and look into that format.
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned that, I've had sort of flashbacks to venues where there's a significant number of steps between the trade show floors and the conference rooms where the content is, and any kind of misplanning of the time it takes to get back and forth ends up in potentially ruining the show. The other thing is that if there's nothing magnetic on the trade show floor to get the people through there, you can see the producers just struggling with a way to make the trade show exhibitor portion happy, right? Like, but if they didn't get the traffic, if the trade show floor was empty, ghost town, now you have exhibitors who are upset. So the venue ends up being so important from that perspective. And I hadn't really thought about it till you dragged the horror story up of me having to think, like, I have to decide, do I head out to the trade show floor, and they've got lunch there because that's the only way they could get me there, right?
Yeah.
And then, but I also have these other events and the networking. So any best practices from a perspective of venue selection, that includes sort of making the decisions between sort of the cheap cities from a hotel perspective, like the Atlantic cities and Las Vegases of the world, where the hotels to some extent are subsidized in some cases by gambling or whatever,
Yeah.
right? Versus the New York cities, where the hotels are obscenely expensive and the venue spaces are sometimes expensive and sometimes reasonable, but your overall cost, all in, is an order of magnitude higher, right? As a planner, you sort of need to weigh those things against each other.
Yeah, you're right. And again, it comes back to what's the format of the event? What's the objective? What's your audience size? Is it trade show? Is it conference? That kind of stuff. I'm a big believer in using odd and off the wall venues. In the US where you are, there's a whole headache of unionization, which comes along with organizing events in venues, and preferred suppliers, which come with locked in contracts. So you have to use them from a supply chain perspective, and you can buy out of them, but then that costs you an obscene amount. So the real thing is, when the advice for anybody looking at booking a venue is due diligence. Make sure you understand that contract, make sure you understand the buy-ins and the tie-ins and the legalities of it. And, if you can, don't get locked into a room block that you have to commit to fill and things like that, which, for anybody listening that doesn't know what a room block is, it's basically a commitment from a hotel that you're going to fill 200 rooms in the hotel as part of you hiring a space. One of the routes that we went to for our event in Vegas is we've actually hired a location called the Expo, which is downtown. It's at the top of Fremont Street, and that is a non-unionized venue, and it's a blank box. So we can do whatever we want in there. It's not come with a room block. And that, for us launching that event over the last couple of years, has been very helpful from that being able to alleviate that stress. But what I would also say is, for anybody who's thinking about launching a venue, think about where you want to go in your spare time. Right? Like, where do you want to spend your spare time in? You want to spend it in interesting places, in interesting venues. And hey, hell, if you can't do that, organize it at a hotel on the beach. Nobody ever complained about being next to the sea. I think those kind of strategies, unique venues, odd places, different things, like you said, lots of people go to Vegas for events, and Florida and places like that. So, like, how can you think out of the box? And is there something that fits with your demographic? Like, does your audience demographic do a lot of skiing? So is Salt Lake City the place to go, kind of thing? Do you know what I mean? Because then there's that attraction of, like, oh, I can do business over here, but maybe I can spend the week and skiing. So there's like that depth of thought that has to go into, like, what does your attendee do in their personal life outside of that could attract them to our event?
So events sometimes reach a certain tipping point in size where you would no longer use the word intimate to describe the networking, but yet sometimes people want to sort of retain that intimacy. So are there any strategies that have worked to sort of regain that intimacy as an event sort of breaks that 300, 400, 500, 600, 800, 1,000 person level? Are there ways to sort of restructure them, either from an agenda perspective or from a flow perspective, or like, segment the attendees in interesting ways to bring that intimacy back that a lot of people really seem to, after the fact, say, I really enjoyed the conversations in the bar or whatever. And you find that a lot of the gigantic places lose that. I mean, it's hard to be intimate at CES, for example.
It is. And, it's about, like you say, it's about being that curator and that facilitator of those opportunities to meet and connect and things like that, right? And again, you have to break it down to what does that attendee look like? I think first time at networking events, most a fantastic thing. There's so many people that have never experienced an event before, never been to it, and them coming back is really dependent on them making connection. And there's nothing better than two people standing across from each other going, oh, it's the first time. So like those barriers are broken down straight away. People are much more relaxed. What are you expecting? What are you doing? All of those questions flow. Networking experiences like, there's always a group of people that love to run. So why not put on the running event? I think I've seen one event recently, just pop up recently, that's doing a pickleball tournament. I know that's a new thing. Lots of people are getting into pickleball. So get people together on physical activities. Back to my other thing, are there other social giving engagements that can be curated around the event? Is there an engagement with a school or a charity or something like that people will be like, I want to give my time to do that. That's a great experience. I love being a part of that and part of that event. I think technology can play a role in that, but technology is not the savior for it. If you think people are going to jump on apps and automatically make connections and make loads of friends and then meet up at the trade show or the event, that's just not how it happens. Do you know what I mean? It's not like that. But one great company that I will give a shout out to, and I've only just recently come across these, is a company called Jampact. And what Jampact try and help organizers do is facilitate those other external curricular event activities, dinners, networking opportunities, clubs, whatever that might be, but without adding the pressure on top of the organizer to manage, organize, and facilitate that. So they come in as a partner. They help curate those activities with you. And then obviously those activities are offered to attendees either complimentary or as an additional fee or as a sponsored thing. And actually companies themselves who may be bringing 3 or 4 of their team or bigger teams to those events can themselves go through that solution and curate something just for them, which many companies are now using events to do offsites and things like that as well. So I think that's an area to look at with partners like that. As organizers, you can't organize everything.
Right.
How can you partner with companies like that to facilitate those things, create a great experience of high value? And that's the thing that people remember and come back.
Yeah, you that leads me to a really fun follow-up question. Increasingly, I've seen sort of different flavors of co-location occur with regards to events. Sometimes it's that folks with a similar audience actually collaborate and just say, well, if you're going to be there and I'm going to be there, we'll have separate tickets. We won't necessarily recognize that the people can go back and forth with the same badge, but we can collaborate. Then there's the folks who sort of piggyback on events and say, oh, there's this gigantic event. I'm going to run an event in the evening or whatever without the permission or knowledge of the event producer. And sometimes that seems to really piss off the primary event producer, who's often also curating events in the evening that might conflict. And then there's the folks who say, oh, well, they're going to be there from Wednesday through Friday. I'm going to do something on Tuesday and try to get the folks to come in early, or vice versa, plug it on the back end of the event. And so taking advantage of the fact that exhibitors will already have their booths in town or whatever. So there seems to be some ways to generate a fair amount of tension, right? In the case of where it's done without you're asking forgiveness instead of permission, basically, for being there. And are there any sort of best practices around? I know for Cannes Lions, for example, it seemed like a whole bunch of stuff was sort of popping up coincidentally at the same time in the same city, right? And at other venues that happen to not necessarily be on the show agenda, but yet people knew about it. And then there's some of them are done, just taking advantage of the audience being in town. So for folks who want to be more guerrilla or scrappy, do you recommend that they sort of do those kinds of strategies where they take advantage of somebody's heavy horsepower, right? That maybe puts a bunch of folks in a city at the same time and either glue something on the front or the back end of that, or try to do sort of a party strategy for the evening.
Yeah, I think it's those things are inevitable, and they happen sometimes innocently and sometimes more strategically, shall we say. And I think, what we always try and do with the companies that we work with is we always try and find a way for them to amplify their time. So, we've had companies that come and exhibit with us, and then they'll do a private dinner at something like the Shard between some partners. Maybe some of them aren't exhibiting or sponsoring, but some of them are, and there's a bunch of attendees. I'm actually fine with that. I see value in that because that's elevating the experience of some of our attendees. And some of those companies are still working with us to fund the central event. If somebody was to create some kind of trade show model or something similar to ours at the back end of I often get asked, oh, Adam, why don't you take your brand and run something alongside this trade show over in this place around the same time or anything like that? That for me is not cricket, because it doesn't feel right. I would say it's always better to collaborate with an organizer and try and find ways to work together. And there's going to be a reason that you want to do something that runs alongside the event rather than at the event. If it's a commercial thing because you think you can run a party cheaper than you can exhibit at an event, then that's either an extremely, extremely expensive event, or something's missing in between where you've not seen the value in the event, but you've seen value in the audience. So my approach would always be to try and work with the show organizer. And, we've had companies come to us and say, a trade show booth's not right for us right now because of bandwidth or people, and we still want to be involved in some way. We actually had that with a company at our Vegas show last year, and they threw an after show party, collaborated with us. There was a little bit of revenue towards us to help support them and market that to our attendees and things like that, and that was absolutely fine, but they did their own thing. I think it's when companies come and approach it I feel like these things often come out of bad blood, right? Somebody's been disgruntled somewhere along the way, and they were like, pardon my French, screw that event, we're going to do his own thing, kind of thing. Yeah. So maybe that's back to the organizer on that side of things. But yeah, I think it's inevitable. You can't avoid it. For any company that wants to do it, there's no rules to it. Do you know what I mean? There's no rules to it, but don't be surprised if the show organizer comes in and makes your life hard. Do you know what I mean?
It does sound, though, like your recommendation for show organizers, and particularly those in sales at the show organizer who would, typically have prepackaged sponsorships at all these various tiers, that the sales team should potentially be a bit more flexible in being willing to collaborate with somebody and say, well, this isn't on our menu, right? But if we can find a way to collaborate, it may not be something that we had thought of ahead of time, but, let's kind of have a conversation about it, right? If it is actually a rising tide that floats all boats higher, they should perhaps be a little more flexible and not work exclusively off of that menu. Now, that may be more difficult when it's something owned by Informa or Emerald or a gigantic organization, but certainly for the more independently run event organizers, maybe the sales team should have a little more flexibility than just stuff that was pre-printed on the prospectus.
Yeah, and our strategy around that is, okay, so let's say a big trade show booth's not right for them, is a smaller trade show booth, just so they've got some presence at the show. Could be a one-man stand. Yeah. Better than not having anything, but then invest that money in doing something around the show with our help that adds value to them and to us. Maybe that's a super high-end VIP dinner that they're basically all funding, and we get to send all our VIPs to this, and they're looked after and things like that. Great experience for them. We've not had to pay for that, but then there's still some presence at the show. So there's like that value exchange potentially between the show organizer and things. I think it's quite easy to get caught up in my show needs to scale and grow, and all of these companies just need to book more square meters, square feet and grow that way. But I think there's more than one way to skin a cat. And I look at, I've had customers who have had very prosperous times and very hard times, and we don't deal with them any differently because they're scaling their investment back one year to the next. Our approach is always try to create really, really long-lasting relationships, but on the understanding that those change from time to time. The direction, the initiative, the budget availability from companies changes all the time. You can't just expect companies to continually grow and invest in bigger and bigger stands, or even sometimes the same thing that they've had for years.
Right.
You've got to find different ways to collaborate with people.
So what has you excited about the industry as a whole and potentially your show coming up? Is there anything that sticks out for you?
Well, I'll not talk about my show too much because we've kind of touched on it a bit already. I think, like you said, the industry's coming back. I think there's a huge opportunity for us to attract a much wider net in terms of talent acquisition into the industry. I think events are always going to be the lifeblood of people coming together and that real pure connection of things. And that's not just trade shows and conferences, that's festivals and going out to gigs at the weekend and all that kind of stuff. I think as an industry, what I'm really hopeful for is we've really started to take a hard look at sustainability when it comes to our events. We ultimately ask people to come long distances and build things and create things for very, very short periods of time. And there are some great organizations out there, both professionally and as associations and things like that, that are kind of really taking a hard, cold look at that of like, okay, our part in it, travel aside, because airlines and things like that, they're taking care of aviation and things. But like from what we do as an event, what can we do? And that's just not ecological, that's social. So that's accessibility, diversity, inclusion, that's governance, that's giving back. I think it's an average of something at the moment. And please, if I'm quoting the statistic wrong, I do apologize, but I think I'm recalling it right. It's something like 1 in every 10 people of working age have some accessibility need. But that's not necessarily reflected as what we see in the attendance of events. And that's often because as show organizers, we're not necessarily conveying and communicating well enough all of the things that we are doing to try to make that event accessible. So my top tips there are, communicate the accessibility of the venue that you're in, communicate anything that you're doing on the show floor or at the event. Are you, closed captioning is something that we've seen for a long, long time, but is really only starting to really come into the events industry now. So people who are hard of hearing can read, or, the other people that need to read things and things like that. So translation as well, we often only produce content in English, but our audiences are diverse and multicultural, and English is not necessarily their first language. So again, we have taken the steps and investment into using AI and technology to translate all of our content live into multiple different languages so people can listen to it in their preferred language.
That's awesome stuff. I look forward to keeping up with the industry as a result of your publication and your events and such. So thanks so much for joining me, Adam.
Thank you for having me on.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street. If Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.